Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification. Today we're remote at a conference in Hilton Head, South Carolina, teaching some classes on CMMC, but taking some time out to interview Mike Gordon from Lockheed Martin about CMMC and some of the activities they're doing there. I do want to mention that we're recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations seeking certification, and that's primarily who we have in our audience today. If you have questions from the audience, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work some of those questions in as we can. I'll start with introduction of Mike Gordon. Mike is newly assigned as VP of Technology Delivery and IT Operations at Lockheed Martin. He spent 20 plus years at Lockheed Martin, just completed a tenure as their CISO prior to accepting this new role. And as the security leader at Lockheed Martin, Mike's been setting their strategy for CMMC compliance, as well as how they're managing supply chain risk and other cybersecurity factors. Mike, thanks for joining us today, and congratulations on your new role.
Oh, thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always an exciting thing to talk about security. It's been almost a lifelong passion for me at this point, and happy to continue the dialogue.
Likewise, let's start with kind of your personal shift in focus from that security leader role, the CISO role, to these broader issues now of IT operations. So realizing this is a new position for you, how has that ops perspective changed your thinking or priorities around cybersecurity, or has it?
Yeah, so at this point, I don't know that my views on cybersecurity have changed. Well, and I don't even know that my views on how to manage a large enterprise IT organization has changed, but I think bringing in the long-term security perspective into the IT operations world is an important aspect. So you kind of never lose your roots, and it's not like I'm suddenly going to forget security and start doing things in an insecure way. Quite the other way around. As I think about how do I want to transform technology and IT in the company, I'm thinking a lot about how can I do that in not only in a more agile way, but also in a more secure long-term way. Not that we're not secure today, but there's, I think the security bar is one of constant movement upwards, right? So there's always an opportunity to continue to improve security throughout the life cycle of IT.
Let me ask about CMMC specifically, as far as what's happening with CMMC at Lockheed Martin. Has CMMC as an initiative came in, changed any priorities, changed the way you're behaving, or is it really just focusing some processes that you already had in the works?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about the scale of corporations when we talk about CMMC. And so it is not lost on me that I've worked most of my life and I've represented a very large aerospace and defense company. And I'm very good, colleagues with my peers and other large aerospace and defense companies. And so we've been working on security collaboratively for most of my life, 20 years in the company doing this. And so I feel real good about the positioning for the larger corporations for CMMC readiness. The CMMC assessments for us are more of a validation, right? Just to validate what we think we already know, that we're doing pretty well in this world. There have been a few things over the last few years that I think, the larger companies have had to sort through, and that started pre-CMMC. That started with NIST 800-171 DFARS requirements, and decomposing those items and making sure that we were actually meeting them. Because I think if you look at the history of our industry, we're not regulated in the sense of like the financial industry is heavily regulated, lots of PCI compliance and things, and the energy industry is heavily regulated with NERC and FERC. And so from a security perspective, there's never been a regulation on aerospace and defense prior to the DFAR 7012 clause a few years ago, invoking NIST 800-171. So I think everyone, as we went through that journey, it was just new, right? Because we were in this process of kind of thinking like the adversaries, building defense in depth, building intelligent frameworks into our defenses, and not so much about like, do I have, FIPS validated controls, right? So there was some effort there and some loose ends to tie up, I think, in the large companies. I think the mids and smalls have a different scenario, right? I often talk to audiences, both in the government and in industry, around the financial ability for companies to be successful in cybersecurity. Really good cyber work requires investment, and it's kind of one of these natural things. And in a lot of ways, the bigger your company is, the more you can invest in it. And so I do believe that small businesses and mid-sized businesses will struggle to achieve the financial ability to invest in cybersecurity. And this is a really long answer to your question, but that's where maybe they need to look at a little bit of IT transformation too. How do they bake more security naturally into their IT? And then also, how can they leverage the knowledge of the large companies and companies like yourselves to their benefit? And finally, and I know we'll talk about this more later, what can we all do together to try to raise the bar for everyone at a lower price point?
Well, let's dig into some of those issues for the smaller companies. And certainly I would say everybody on the call today is a smaller company than the one you represent, right? So that's kind of a given. And it is a challenge. As we look at, CMMC coming out and specifying a level, one of the things with the flow down is that the level of the contract comes out at, as you flow that down to lower tiers of the supply chain, it's somewhat up to you as a prime potentially to decide what level is required of the subcontractors based on the kind of data that you're sharing with them. We've heard from some primes that they're working to kind of systematically reduce the number of their suppliers that they pass controlled and classified information to as a way to reduce the burden, right? If they don't pass them the data, they don't need that data. They only need to be level one. They can, the financial ability to achieve that is much more likely. Is that something that you're actively managing at Lockheed Martin?
Absolutely, we're looking at that, but I think it's complex, right? What you described is one variable of a really, multifaceted equation. And so it is true. Companies, whether I'm a big company or a small company, we should manage data well, right? We should not flow data that shouldn't flow. I mean, this sounds so obvious, but in a lot of ways, it's easier to flow more than it is to flow less. So, I think that is an effort that all companies, big and small, need to think about. Is the right data go into the right place? There have been many conversations I've heard about, well, hey, big companies, why don't you provide a platform in which the small companies can do work on your platform, in a cloud or otherwise, and it's a secure platform, right? So, hey, Mike, you go build a Lockheed accredited platform, CMMC level, whatever, and Ed's Aerospace comes and works on it. Well, that also doesn't always work, right? That may work fine if you, Ed, are providing a service to me, maybe for software development, right? You're writing code for a platform that I'm delivering as the prime. Sure, maybe I provide you a secure environment and you come and you build your code in it. That doesn't work if the innovation that I'm acquiring through my partnership with you is your innovation. If you're developing the formula for a new stealth coding, that's your recipe, it's your formula. You're going to build and design that on your network, right? And I'm acquiring the output of that, the actual stealth coding. And so it doesn't make sense for you to come do that work, in my environment, because it's your work, it's your business. And so, there's a lot of different things we have to think about when we talk about how we're flowing things down to the smalls and how they're going to conduct work.
But one of the things we see that we don't have good clarity on from many smaller companies is, especially if they're further down the supply chain, meaning they're removed from the details of the government contract that they're supporting, is they're not sure if they have any CUI, right? So they're saying to their customers, hey, can you tell me, do we have CUI? And they're having trouble getting answers in some cases. Are you getting those questions? And how do you treat that in the sense of trying to give them a definitive answer, yes or no? I mean, who decides if the data that's being passed to them or the data that they're creating is CUI?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this all starts at original contracting, right, between the prime and the government, there has to be a discussion around what is CUI and what is the level of protection required on it, aka CMMC levels 1 through 5, right? And so if we're building an air vehicle, then there's a good chance that that air vehicle as a unit, as a platform, is going to be a level 5, CMMC. It's going to have all the different types of CUI in it, right?
Mhm.
But we've got to have realistic conversations with our contracting partners on the government side to determine, what subcomponents of that air vehicle are higher or lower in terms of the security maturity that we need to protect them, right? Arguably, the tires are probably CMMC level 1 or not CMMC at all, right? But the, I don't know, some special sensor is probably a level 5 or 4 or somewhere in there, right? And so I think we have to have these decomposition discussions early in the platform contracts, the primes do. And then the information is easier to distill and flow down, right? So I know that if I'm hiring Ed for tires, I mark that as CUI 1 and, you go give me some tires. And if I'm hiring somebody else for, super sensitive sensor, unclassified sensor, then I make sure I mark that as level 5, right? And I think then if you're my next tier down and you want to deconstruct that sensor, you have a level 5 sensor and you got to decompose it into, nuts and bolts, and maybe there's some mirrors and optics in there. I think we need to have a conversation about which pieces are what.
Are you able to get good, those decomposition discussions? Are you able to have that with the government and get good answers? I mean, that's early in the process, I think, but I'm hearing from a lot of people that probably don't have the access your company may have to the government as far as influencing them to get to these decisions, that they can't get those answers.
Yeah, well, I want to be fair to the government. I want to say it's too soon to tell. Right.
Yep.
I mean, that is the whole purpose of the CMMC. Well, there's many purposes, but one of the main purposes of the CMMC Pathfinders, the initial contracts. And I'm not extremely, completely privy to all the different elements that the DoD is trying to kind of validate in those Pathfinders. But I feel fairly confident that this conversation is one of them, right? Do we know how to issue a contract and to disclose the appropriate protection levels of the information, and are we able to work with the prime and sort of like, I don't think we know yet, right? I think that's what the Pathfinders are for. At least I'm optimistic that's what they're for. And I think, Ed, if I kind of extract back your question a little bit, I certainly understand that there's a lot of companies that have a lot of concern right now over CMMC. What does it all mean to me? And there's a lot of nuts and bolts in those questions, like the ones you just asked, that we don't know the answers yet, and that's okay. I think what businesses should be focused on right now, especially if you're somewhere in tiers 2 through N, is just making sure your company has a good baseline security, right? I think if you build up your security model so that you feel comfortable your network's secure, and then level 3-ish should kind of follow pretty simply, right? And I also don't want to undervalue or understate the fact that people are supposed to be compliant with NIST 800-171 today, right? And so there's this whole self-attestation where folks doing business with the DoD have said, hey, I'm compliant. And so the bar for CMMC level 3 is only 20 additional controls, right? So I would just encourage folks, validate your 800-171, focus on the 20 controls. And at this point, as we sit here in July of 21, I wouldn't fret on the business process side too much, right? That's going to be sorted out on the contracting and business process and all that. I think that will be sorted out through the Pathfinders. That's just Mike's 10 cents worth of opinion.
Makes sense. So speaking of compliance with the 800-171 or the DFAR 7012, we've talked to some companies who feel that they don't have any CUI, and therefore for them, compliance with DFAR 7012 doesn't require them to really implement any controls because they have no data that needs to be protected in that way. So for example, if I have a law in my state that I have to wear a seatbelt when I ride in a car, if I never get in a car, I don't need to buy any seatbelts. I don't even need to buy a car, right? And I'm still fully compliant with that law. So what are you expecting? What is Lockheed Martin expecting from those companies in terms of actions reporting to you? and I'll pick on Lockheed Martin for a second. And we've heard from some specifically that, hey, Lockheed Martin is demanding that we send them evidence of our compliance. We have no covered contractor information systems. Therefore, what do we show them, right? If they want to see pictures of my seatbelts, but I don't have a car, what am I supposed to show to these folks who are asking these questions?
Yeah, so that's a fair question, and it's a fair concern, right? And it's true. We are very much, as part of our overall CMMC posture, trying to baseline where our supply chain is, right? I mean, when there's smaller primes too, so I don't want to make anybody think that I'm ignorant to the fact that there's prime work in smalls, but you got these large companies, Lockheed being one of probably the bigger six. Part of our scope of work is to really understand what does our supply chain look like. So when we're thinking about contracts and everything, do our contractors and suppliers have the right level of security to be considered for a program? And so I guess my answer, I never thought about this question before, but I have a multifaceted, what should they do answer. Part one starts with, just reach out to us, right? Like I get lots of questions, in my old role. Now the Joel Johnson, the new CISO, gets the questions, but it's the same foundational team behind the scenes working them about, the questionnaires and the requirements that we push down. And so if there's a company out there who got that request from us and you think, there's no seatbelts here, to use your analogy, then just let us know, right? But I would also say, if you're the company with that, you have none of that today, from a business perspective, what do you want to do tomorrow, right? Are you hoping to be on a future contract with Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, one of the bigger companies, right? L3Harris, and if so, then you probably want to get that compliance regime moving, right? The security regime. So
that's usually the conversation we have with them is, do you need that capability? Even if you don't have any today, do you want to represent to your customers that you're capable of handling this? Or do you want to say, no, we're the kind of company that never processes CUI. We make things that don't require it ever, right? So
and let me take this question too. I want to pull the context away for a second. I know this is a CMMC dialogue, but let's forget about CMMC for a second and just talk about security and running a business, right? Running a small business. If I'm Mike's small business and I'm producing, screws and washers, right? No CUI, and I have a massive ransomware attack and I cannot restore my business, I'm probably going to go bankrupt, right? Doesn't matter that I did or didn't lose CUI. And so I think it is critically important for business owners to, if you care about your business, make sure your business has a level of security that is commensurate with the state of the world in 2021, right? Which is a lot different even than the state of the world in 2019, and I used ransomware very much on purpose. It's everywhere. And the ransomware operators are aggressive and they don't care if you have CUI or not, right? But the security controls that will help you prevent ransomware are not that different than the security controls you need to have CMMC compliance.
And ransomware is not just about the financial impacts of recovering your data. They're now, exposing the data, right? So there is an intellectual property loss component to that, as well as the financial loss. So both those things add together. I'll ask a couple more questions about supply chain and others, because we have a lot of those folks in our audience, and then I have some audience questions that came in about your approach within Lockheed Martin and how you handle it at a large scale. So so I'll stick on the current thread for a couple more. Are you hearing a need for assistance and enablement? You mentioned, hey, people have said to you, could you just build some computing and we could use it? And you're saying that's not appropriate in all cases. What else are you hearing there? Are people asking for Lockheed Martin to help them either understand or comply? And if so, what are you doing in response to that? What's your advice or assistance?
Yeah. There's some overt asks and there's some probably a lot more just implied need, right? I guess from what we know about the industry. And so I'll share that the industry primes kind of organized, self-organized together a few years ago under our sector coordinating council construct. We don't have a fancy name for it, but it's our DIB supply chain cybersecurity task force. It's not even a good acronym, right? But the point is, we banded together to say, how do we help assist everybody else out there who might need it, whether they're asking or not? And the first thing we did was we built a web page that's our Cyber Assist website. And so it's, sorry to give a plug it, I guess it's okay. It's the National Defense ISAC, NDISAC.org, and, you know, Cyber Assist. And what that site does is it spells out all the different 800.171 and CMMC controls and kind of different ways to come into compliance with them. And we also try to put out important things that are hot in the world. You know, hey, here's some ransomware guidance. Here's some other good security guidance. That's the first step. That's just this educate step. And there's a lot of education needed, and that's only one way. You know, the work that you all are doing in the workshops you're providing, you know, wherever you said you were today, those are helping too, right? But I truly believe, and this is a soapbox platform for me, that the government and the industry need to come together to provide technology solutions at a low to no cost, you know, point, probably low cost point to the small companies for key capabilities that will provide security and check off several of the requirements for CMMC. So examples. This is the world's favorite example. Everybody talks about it. It's a protected DNS, PDNS, right? So this is just a good way to stop adversary command and control. It's a good way to stop exfiltration. It's not perfect. It is one of many defense in depth mechanisms. And it's not cheap, right? You know, for any one company to go out and buy that service, it costs some money. But I think what we can do together is formulate a service that's companies can subscribe to as either part of a membership to a not-for-profit, part of something they get from a government partner when they're on contract with those partners. There's a lot of ways, right? So I've kind of found that the technology part, we know how to do that. It's the business model part of how do we deliver these capabilities at the right low price point so there's heavy adoption and people get security out of them. So, you know, PDNS is one, secure email we talk about a lot. How do we do perimeter validation, right? So if you're on the internet, then anybody can see your perimeter, good guys and bad guys. So how do we build a service as good guys? And we tell you what we see. You know, user training and awareness, phishing testing. You know, any company on this phone call or anywhere else can go hire a third party. There's lots of them these days that'll do, you know, set up phishing programs for your company. But if you're a small business, it's probably not price scalable for you. So how do we band together and get economy of scale, you know, and do that? So Lockheed Martin, you know, we're kind of leaning forward ourselves to try to build out some of these capabilities and run some pilots with some of our suppliers. We're also talking with government partners like the NSA to do that. And we're talking to organizations like the National Defense ISAC and the Center for Internet Security for how might we come together to deliver all those things in the long term.
That's all good stuff. I think there's, you know, definitely a need for, I'll call it consumer ready, but security, you know, IT products that have the right security configuration that somebody can buy and use without needing to be an expert. A lot of small companies don't have access to expertise, and so they need things that they can buy and use in a secure way without having to, you know, become cyber engineers. So that's all good stuff. Got a few good audience questions here. First one is, well, somebody asked if they can get the link to the Cyber Assist program you mentioned. I'll say we'll put that in a follow-up email. So we'll get that link, validate it, and we'll email it out to everybody who's on the call today. So rather than trying to communicate it verbally. And then question is, how did Lockheed approach defining its CMMC scope? So one of the challenges for, you know, any organization that's above the sort of minimal complexity is what's in scope, what's out of scope, which systems process CUI, which don't, which process FCI, which don't, maybe some corporate aspects that have nothing to do with government contracting. I don't know if that's a factor for you or not, but some companies, you know, they have a large commercial component that's not involved with FCI at all. How did you approach scope and what was your methodology for doing that?
Yep, so our methodology was to look at first understanding what are our enterprise systems that house CUI, right? And so, you know, you think about your enterprise email, there's CUI in there, right? Probably your enterprise SharePoints and collaboration services and things like that. some of the core business systems, right? ERP, PLM, MES, those types of capabilities, whether they're an enterprise system like core, like, multifaceted enterprise, or a business line of business specific system that are core to those businesses. It certainly has CUI in it. So we did a big scoping exercise to understand, first off, where are enterprise systems that have CUI, and then, built up a regime to validate the security of all of those enterprise systems. And vocabulary words get tricky here, right? Because, a system could be 200 servers. When I talk about the email system, it's a lot of devices, right? And so we do kind of track things at this level of environment and system. And then we decompose it down into the tens, hundreds, and thousands of IT assets that formulate that environment and system. And so that's kind of pass one, right? Get our belt tight around the enterprise, and then we start moving down into the program stacks, right? So let's look at a particular program, the widget one program, and let's validate what CUI the widget one program has, and understand, what systems support that program. They're not necessarily what we would call an enterprise system, and then start working the same process, right? And then for us, where we are, in the supply chain, that's all the internal work. Then there's this kind of external work that says, as you mentioned earlier, where are our suppliers, right? And we do the same thing. What are our most critical enterprise suppliers? Those suppliers who provide services to multiple programs that have CUI or a critical path program for us, and validate their security. And then, you kind of take the next pass and say, okay, who are the widget one program suppliers, and what level of data do they get, and how do we feel about how they're doing?
Cool. There's, as happens often on this series, an audience question came in, which is a much more better wording of a question I was going to ask around the pass-fail nature, and getting to the idea of having no POAMs throughout all of Lockheed Martin, which isn't to me seems like an awesome challenge that I don't know you could get to. But this is kind of directing that more at the manufacturers that support you rather than at you yourself, getting to that sort of same pass-fail. So it's a much more colorful version. I'll ask the audience member. It says, yes, we're supposed to be compliant with 800-171, but realistically, no actual manufacturing company is compliant. Name one and I'll prove it. I can cite many areas which are simply impossible to achieve. I can secure our system without the administration overhead. Oh, scrolling off my screen, sorry. I've already spent over $1 million trying, but the last 100 yards is really stupid. So I think that's the key, right? Is getting 90% or 95% of the way through those controls is pretty doable, but there always seems to be a couple things that are way harder than would seem worth the benefit. What's your take on that? The 100% no POAM requirement within CMMC?
So I think it's important. So I don't know. There's somewhere the person that wrote the question. There's a few things that are very specific that are probably on their mind, and I probably won't touch on those because I don't know what they are. But I think we all recognize in industry, and I do believe our government partners also understand that there is never any perfect IT system, right? IT is it's dynamic. I mean, every day. I mean, I could be 100% patched, 100% everything right here at 1:29 p.m. Eastern time, and 2 minutes later, there's a 0-day vulnerability or a new patch comes out from Microsoft or whatever it is.
CMMC allows for that, so that's acceptable, it seems, right?
Yeah, and so I think it's all about maturity, right? So that's why I do love the word maturity in the name. I think as people are going to get their assessments, it's about demonstrating maturity, that I have processes and procedures around handling the things that might not exactly fit, right? So I don't know the specific control or specific concern that the question asker had, but I would just focus more on, do you have a good, solid, mature process, and not am I 100% compliant to that? I got 1 million devices. Are they all perfect relative to that control? Now, the question on POAMs is one where I think we need to sort that out with our partners in the DoD, right? I'm not an anti-POAM person. I do think that some POAMs could make sense, but I also recognize that there's a whole governance model that DoD A&S has to put in place to make that reasonable and acceptable, right? How long is a POAM really good for? What are the thresholds for when a POAM should or shouldn't be available? Then you've got the whole accreditation body has got to train the assessment. So it's easier for, it's definitely easier for the assessment process and for the government if it's pass or fail, right? And I'm not saying they're taking the easy way, but there's a lot of work to figure out the POAMs. And I think they're open-minded to that to a degree, right? I think it's the complexity of the POAM question that makes it not an overnight decision for our government.
And avoiding the forever POAM, right? I think under the current regime, pre-CMMC, you could theoretically have 110 POAMs, one for each control, and you have them for 50 years. And technically, maybe that's no rule that says you can't do that. So I don't think that's in the spirit of things, but you know what I'm saying? There's not been any real reckoning of it, of what's acceptable and what's not. So
yeah, it's hard. I don't envy, the DoD team trying to sort that part out, right? I mean, I don't think anybody would ever do what I'm about to say, but what if somebody said, I can't afford a perimeter firewall, I need a POAM, right? I don't think we'd accept that. I don't think that's smart, right? Hey, I got my company's in the wide open internet, right? Versus what if somebody said, hey, I need, 2 months to go replace my, I don't know, my proxy server with FIPS compliant gear in it. Okay, right? Yeah. But there's no simple answer here, and you get into the control by control based decisions on POAMs, and so it's an unenviable problem to figure out how to allow those.
Yeah. So the other version of that firewall one is I just bought a brand new firewall from one of the top 4 vendors, but the newest model that they're currently selling isn't FIPS 140-2 because it hasn't finished validation yet. Do you really want me to throw that away and go buy an old firewall and put that in because it's approved, or should I stick with the new one while it finishes the approval process? I mean, there's not really a good mechanism to answer those kind of practical questions today. So I think
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree, and I'll go back to something I said earlier, is where I really think that this is where the pathfinders come into play, right? We've got to let this process execute and find those stumbling blocks, and let's go have real discussions in the real world of, hey, I just bought this firewall and it's not yet compliant. What do you want me to do?
Right, and get some case law laid down so people can feel some confidence. I think that's a lot of what we're hearing is that people are not confident. They don't, because it hasn't been worked out. They're like, well, I'm not sure, and I'm worried about that risk. And maybe they're worried about risks that they shouldn't. So I'll ask that as a kind of a wrap-up question. I always like to ask, how can we get better results? Spend our time and effort working on the things that actually matter for cybersecurity. I do hear people, maybe myself included, get wrapped around axles that are not that constructive, like maybe this firewall example I just used. As you're watching companies reacting to recent events, the threats we've had, to reacting to CMMC, what's your one piece of advice for people making decisions? Where should they get the best bang for their buck for the limited time and resources they have? Yeah.
Decide what in your world moves the bar on security the most, the fastest, right? There's a long list of controls in CMMC. There's a 1,000,001 security best practices out there from lots of security professionals like us. But if you're engaging with folks, it's a risk model, it's a threat model. Where does your company have the biggest security risk? And prioritize it from a risk burn down perspective, right? The FIPS validated firewall is probably not the world's highest risk, right? Not having a firewall would be, right? Not having a patching process that gets your patches out there in an expedited way and you can validate them probably is, right? Having open FTP servers, there's so many things. So that's my simple advice is, this is about threats versus risks. Understand where your biggest cyber threats are and burn down the biggest risks first.
Good advice. Thanks, Mike. And I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank the audience for their time and attention. Please join us for future town hall meetings. We're going to be back next week on August 4th at our 1 p.m. Eastern timeframe. We have David Gould from data governance firm Encompass going to talk to us about data governance as a service. And thanks very much. We'll see everyone next time.
Thank you.